The plot of the game is fairly straightforward. Your party members are members of a resistance against an evil emperor. Toward the end of the game, the emperor is killed, but Leon, who had gone missing near the start of the game, takes his place. After defeating Leon, he joins your party against the newly resurrected emperor, who had taken over Hell. Final Fantasy II was another commercial success, though its high level of difficulty and unusual approach to character growth led critics to brand it as a black sheep of the series. Final Fantasy II was not released in the United States, though it's not for lack of trying. Square attempted to have the game localized as Final Fantasy II Dark Shadow over Palakia, but as it was a much more text-heavy game than the original, it proved much more difficult than they had originally thought. Although translation of the game was almost completed, the process had taken so long that by the time a working beta was done, Final Fantasy IV was already available for the Super Famicom. The project was scrapped, leaving Americans without Final Fantasy II until many, many years later. While Final Fantasy II was going through its localization woes, Square was already at work on the next game, Final Fantasy III. Although II had introduced many lasting improvements and conventions to the series, Square made Final Fantasy III as more of a return to form, returning RPG staples such as experience points and levels. In a lot of ways, 3 shared a lot of things in common with the original Final Fantasy, as it was once again revisiting the idea of light warriors and elemental crystals, though this time in a different setting. Returning from the original game were characters that were created and named by the player, as well as the choice of jobs. However, the job system in 3 was refined, having much more in common with the job system seen in Enix's game Dragon Quest III and Into the Legend. The player characters started off as a base class known as the Onion Knight, and throughout the game gained access to more jobs, including returning favorites from Final Fantasy, as well as new jobs such as Geomancer, Scholar, and Dancer. Even the Dragoons from 2 were now playable. The plot was once again straightforward, but the gameplay was improved, using parts of the last 2 games as well as a retooled inventory system, improved graphics, and tweaks to the battle mechanics. Final Fantasy III is probably the strongest of the original 3 Famicom titles, though like Final Fantasy II, it was not localized. Square did make an attempt at localizing Final Fantasy III, but as they couldn't get 2 done by the time the 16-bit era had come and 4 had been released, 3 never really stood much of a chance. Add to this the fact that American gamers were abandoning the NES in favor of the new 16-bit machines much faster than Japanese gamers had, and Square saw very little profit potential and scrapped the localization product. The original 3 NES titles, Final Fantasy, Final Fantasy II, and Final Fantasy III, are all great titles, but can be difficult to come across today, especially 2 and 3. Though Final Fantasy was released in America, it is now a rare collector's item, making it difficult to get, and 2 and 3 were never released at all in America. Though it is possible to import the titles, they are still uncommon and will only play on Japanese hardware, and of course will not be in English. The beta cartridge of Final Fantasy II Dark Shadow over Palakia is also extremely rare. Some have turned to emulation to play these old games, particularly since fan-made translations are available for 2 and 3. Interestingly enough, the beta version of 2 was so uncommon that fan translators were completely unaware of its existence and translated the game from scratch. However, though emulation is a perfectly viable option, it does fall under the blanket of software piracy. And although some people are comfortable with emulating old 8-bit games, not everyone is. Luckily, these games have been re-released several times, and each now has seen a full US release at one point or another. The original Final Fantasy was released on the MSX2 home computer in Japan, with an improved color palette, though it had some other graphical and gameplay issues that made most prefer the original game. The next re-release was on the Famicom itself, as Square released Final Fantasy and Final Fantasy II together on the same cartridge. This stayed in Japan, and interestingly enough, was the last official Famicom game to be released. Final Fantasy next showed up on a handheld, the WonderSwan Color, which was a system exclusive to Japan. This version had redrawn graphics, making it more in line with the 16-bit entries into the series, and a new soundtrack. Final Fantasy II was soon after also released on the WonderSwan Color, and although Bandai, makers of the WonderSwan, greenlit a version of Final Fantasy III, Square never finished the game, citing hardware limitations and time restrictions, instead choosing to re-release the next game in the series instead. The WonderSwan Color versions of 1 and 2 would be the basis of an eventual PlayStation release, and like the late-era Famicom cart, they were now paired together as Final Fantasy 1 and 2 Collector's Edition, released in America as Final Fantasy Origins. This was the first re-release to appear in the United States, and the first time American gamers got to try Final Fantasy II, not counting emulation, of course. Interestingly enough, the last time they were paired together, it was the last official Famicom game to be released in Japan, and this time it was the last official PlayStation game to be released in America. The pair then got another handheld release on the Game Boy Advance as Final Fantasy I and II Dawn of Souls. This version retooled the magic and combat systems to be more akin to later entries in the series, as well as once again retranslating them. New areas were added to 1, bonus dungeons that could be unlocked where players could fight high-level monsters and bosses from 3, 4, 5, and 6. Added to Final Fantasy II was an added scenario called Soul of Rebirth, in which characters that had died during the main plot came together in the afterlife to fight the Emperor once again. After this, Final Fantasy III, long considered the lost Final Fantasy game, finally got a remake and a localization. The game was retooled in 3D for the Nintendo DS, keeping the same basic gameplay but tweaking some of the basics. Characters now had predefined names and personalities, and the base class was no longer Onion Knight but rather Freelancer. Players could choose to become Onion Knights later on in the game. Unlike the first two games, which have been released again and again, the only two versions of 3 that exist are the original Famicom version and the DS version, making it the most scarcely played game in the series. Lastly, the 20th anniversary of Final Fantasy saw yet another re-release of 1 and 2, this time sold separately for the PlayStation Portable. Featuring completely redrawn high-definition graphics, the gameplay remains faithful to Dawn of Souls, though another new area and boss is added to Final Fantasy I. The original 3 Final Fantasy games for the NES are classics. It's just a shame that so many people missed out on playing 2 and 3 for a long time. I should note that because of these games not appearing in America, the next 2 Final Fantasy games in the series that did get localized would take the names Final Fantasy II and Final Fantasy III, leading to a lot of confusion. I'll talk about more on that in the next part when I go over the next 3 games, the Super NES ones, and hopefully it will be completely cleared up for anybody who's still a little bit confused. So join me next time and we'll cover Final Fantasy IV, V, and VI.